why it is that they're engaging with us to begin with. What problems are we trying to solve for them, and what problems are we trying to solve for their users? A lot of times our clients come to us because they're working in a CMS that just isn't as flexible as they need it to be. They have a really small staff who needs the website to be super easy for them to update. So a lot of times at Ascedia, we'll find ourselves, designing and developing this full platform for them that is really modular, really flexible, easy for a small team on their end to be able to update that, and also teaching them how to do so and understand how to update that.
Hey, everybody, we're back. It's Over a Pint Marketing Podcast. I'm here again with my man, Mr. Kurt Lingle, VP over at Celtic Advertising in the 3rd Ward of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Kurt, we got kind of a different episode today, right?
Okay.
I mean, we've had a lot of amazing guests.
Mm-hmm.
We've got amazing guests today, but most of these guests have been from outside of our immediate sphere, right?
Yeah.
People that, they're writing books, they're doing other things. Well, today we got something a little bit different. Today we got someone from the family. We got Jacob Burr on the show, and he's going to be he's from Ascedia. He's going to be talking about UX UI design. I'm really excited about this. Kind of gives us an opportunity to shine a light on some of our talent. I know we're going to have somebody from Celtic on in a couple of weeks talking about creativity and the creative process and so forth. So this is going to be a little bit different, but I'm really looking forward to it. So let's bring the guest right on. Jacob Burr, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, everyone. It's good to be here.
Good to have you, Jacob.
Thanks so much for being on, Jacob. It's called Over a Pint for a reason, Jacob. We're going to give you, the guest, starting rotation in the lineup. What do you got in front of you, my man? What do you want to plug? What are you having?
Because I have some presentations this afternoon, I do not have a beer. I have a mug of coffee from Scooter's Coffee. So do you guys have that in the Milwaukee area, Scooter's?
No.
No.
Is that local to the area?
That's why I asked. I don't know. They started popping up. They're like these drive-through only coffee shops. They're just like a very basic box-looking building. And I don't know.
No,
good. I'm hoping it's local. I wanted to support local, so that's why
I have not heard of that, Jacob. But for both of you guys, why isn't there more just little drive-through coffee shops like that? It seems like that would be a bigger thing than it is.
Yeah, you got me. I don't know. I like Scooters.
All right,
Scooters. Plugging Scooters.
Mr. Lingo, what are you enjoying today?
Well, I'm going to plug something. This one, usually I'm all about the local too, Pat. I love plugging local. Yep. Today I'm not plugging local.
No.
Okay. But I'm not plugging local. I'm the local guy. I'm going to plug local. But today I'm plugging Guinness. I'm going to tell you why.
What a good choice.
But you know what? Here's why I'm plugging it. So, first of all, it was in our agency refrigerator, so it was easy for me to grab. Let's start there. But the name of our agency is Celtic. And I got to tell you both, Jacob, Pat, March 17 is kind of a big deal at our agency. It's a holiday. We do a lot of fun stuff with the team here, promotional wise. Usually a stout here and there is passed around. So I'm like, you know what? We're having a lot of conversations about Celtic here or about St. Patrick's Day at our agency. So it was on my mind.
It was natural. Cool. Guys, I'm loaded to bear today. So let's start off with the cup of coffee. Check. All right. You got to stay hydrated as well. So I've got a sparkling, I got a LaCroix lemon flavor. Check. Ooh, and then from our main man, Henry Schwartz, glad to meet you. My name is English Style Mild Beer from Mob Craft Brewing.
Wow.
I still have, Kurt, are you done with that? Are you done with all the beer that you got from Henry?
I'm down to I think I've got 3 left. So it was a great. We got to have him back on again next year around this time.
Just to get another one of those. Yeah.
Just get another one of those.
Yeah. Jacob, thanks again for being on the pod. Let's get down to it. Everybody is waiting for this. We're talking UX UI, but before we get into that, just give us a little bit of background about you. Let us get to know you a little bit better. So the mic is yours. Take it away.
Cool. Yeah, so I mean, basically, I mean, in terms of my schooling and like sort of how my career started, I would say, through schooling, went to University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point, which is in central Wisconsin, if people aren't familiar. So smaller school, kind of set in more of a rural area. Had a great time there. Spent 4 years there, studying web and digital media development. So really, what that was set up as was sort of that blend between creativity and development. Went to school with a lot of traditional developers who went on to be, back end, front end developers, those types of things. I always sort of stuck out in that group like a sore thumb because I came to that major wanting to be a creative person with some development knowledge. So I think that's why my pairing with working at Ascedia has worked so well, because we do have a lot of development on staff. So, once I got hired at Ascedia, a lot of the conversations that we needed to have were actually pretty natural. So yeah, spent 4 years there. Worked, Ascedia directly after, and I've been at Ascedia for 8 years. It's either 8 years or maybe it's going to be 9 in September. So it's somewhere around there. So it's been a very long career with Ascedia so far.
Awesome. Awesome. So Jacob, talk to us a little bit about, just for people who may not understand, like the creative process, the creative work you do. Break it down for us in terms of that. Like, what is that? We're at a cocktail party. You say, hey, I work at Ascedia. I'm in the creative area. What do you do? What does that mean?
If I'm at a cocktail party and someone asks, I just say I'm a web designer and then I leave it at that.
Okay.
But anyway, so I think the approach to design at Ascedia is there's a specific angle to it. We're not doing traditional design. Like I'll get asked if I'm a graphic designer. I'm like, no, but I do creative work. It sort of ebbs and flows depending on what project phase that we're in. So, I think the most unique angle that Ascedia has for design is that we try to back up all of our decisions based on data, what we know about the client, what we know about the users, what we know about the environment that we're working in, and then also pairing that with industry trends as well. So, there is that angle of strategy to it. I think when people think of creative or design, which in my world, I do differentiate those two things. I think it's fluff. It's only colors. It's only, pictures, whatever. I think what that all comes down to is communication. Our design department uses design and creativity as a tool for communication. And that's communicating through UI, through content, through photography, graphics, and those types of things. So I think to those folks out there who see design as a fluff piece, a nice thing to have, an additional add-on, I think that they are underselling that aspect of our business, and doing themselves really a disservice because Pat, you and I know that we work a lot in the manufacturing industry, which tends to be pretty traditional, pretty nuts and bolts, very let's do what we know is safe, right? Obviously, manufacturing, there's a lot of safety stuff involved. It's inherent to the industry. It's not necessarily there for risk taking. But I think that's one of their biggest opportunities in terms of that digital space where they can really stand out amongst their competitors, right? Manufacturing in terms of color palettes, we know is like a sea of blue. Okay. All right. How are they going to how is your user base going to remember you versus the other competitors that they looked at that all had pictures of a manufacturing plant with your primary brand color being blue? What is going to make you different in that? And this goes back to that communication as well, communicating your brand values through that creative lens. So I feel like I took your question and kind of
no, and
strung it up in various angles.
You talked about manufacturing, and I'm glad you brought that up because I think especially with that field, there's something that's pretty interesting, and that is until very recently, like pre-pandemic, but like right as we got into the pandemic, I think a lot of people in the manufacturing space didn't really need or didn't want to focus on a website. They understood that they needed to have it, but didn't focus on it and didn't pay the attention it deserved because that's what my salespeople do. They're out talking about the brand. They're making the contacts. They're
Yeah.
doing this and that. But once your sales team can't travel, once your people are grounded, what are you going to do? Right.
Right.
And, Kurt, we heard this from Chad at Steinhoffels. They had to go from a retail player to an e-commerce like in a matter of months. Right. And I'm sure he's not the only one to do that. So I think, with manufacturers especially, there is a more of a focus on, the website can be my best salesman. It can be my best marketing channel. I think that message is starting to come over to them. Hey, Jacob, let's switch a little bit now.
Sure.
And I think for our audience, I think they would appreciate, break down the process that you go through, right? From engaging with a client. So, you're having like initial conversations all the way to, boom, we're launching the site, things are live. Like, what does that look like for you? How do you explain that? Take us through that.
Sure. I forget how many steps there. I think it's like 5 steps or something that we kind of have clearly blocked out at Ascedia, between like 5 and 7. Really, it starts with that initial client engagement, understanding the client, getting an understanding of who they think their users are, and I phrase that very specifically, and understanding, why it is that they're engaging with us to begin with. What problems are we trying to solve for them, and what problems are we trying to solve for their users? A lot of times our clients come to us because they're working in a CMS that just isn't as flexible as they need it to be. They have a really small staff who needs the website to be super easy for them to update. So a lot of times at Ascedia, we'll find ourselves, designing and developing this full platform for them that is really modular, really flexible, easy for a small team on their end to be able to update that, and also teaching them how to do so and understand how to update that. And there's various angles to that, but we can get into that maybe a little bit later. So I guess really that first step in the initial client engagement is understanding what the problems are. And then going from there into our strategic planning process, which is a little bit more thorough of a phase of discovering that understanding. That's data collecting. We're taking a look at their current Google Analytics if they have that. If they don't, we're putting their Google Analytics on the site so we can at least start getting that data over the next couple months just to kind of see where things are at and get that baseline. Also, doing user personas. Who is your target audience? Who are you trying to target? And I phrased it before, who the client thinks their audience is. Is that correct? You can't necessarily read the label from inside the bottle, right?
Yeah.
Where you have to have that outsider perspective. Let's talk to your actual users. Stakeholder interviews are important. I find those interviews being more important on what the client needs from a business standpoint. But you're never going to be able to uncover some of those, like, harder to swallow truths that your users might be encountering, those roadblocks that they might see on your website. We did some user tests actually with one of our clients, and they sold insurance. We were doing some user tests there, and most of the people that didn't have any understanding of who that brand was and what they offered thought that they were a charity, and not an insurance company. Their website was completely failing at what the
Wow.
sole purpose of the site was. So we came back with them and said, hey, you need to refocus on displaying your products up front, what you can do for your users, and make that a little bit more actionable and motivated right there on your homepage with those key actions for them. You can still have that, hey, we're donating to, oh my gosh, I'm forgetting the name of that. Whatever, donating to something, and but maybe put that a little lower on the page. Your homepage, and that initial brand touch point should really be focused on introducing your values and then what you do for your users right there. And they agreed with us, and they signed off on on a lot of our suggestions with that. So really, strategic planning phase is right. We're developing the strategy for what it is that we need to do. We're gathering information and data on what our next steps are going to be when we go into designing the website. There's a technical aspect to that too. I'm obviously not going to get into that because I'm not a developer. Sure.
Yeah.
So from there, obviously, we go into a presentation. Then we start taking it, so hey, we have all this great information, we have a good understanding. Next up, we go into sort of, we can go into, it depends on how design minded that client actually is. We can go right into wireframes, or we can go into sort of that creative direction process. In regard to the wireframes, that's when we start leveraging that data and saying, this is how we're solving your users' problems. This is how we're paying attention to the client's design constraints, right? I could design the coolest website in the world that has drone footage, animated graphics, and all that stuff. But if the client isn't able to maintain that stuff moving forward, it's not really going to make sense for us to incorporate that into the website. So really trying to play into the strengths that that client is going to be able to handle. Wireframes too, right? We're developing the structure. That's the blueprint for the site. We're seeing how we're blocking out different content types, how we're designing UI to allow users to move through a complex workflow in order to accomplish a task. So a lot of the conversation in that piece is around information architecture, site structure, and actual UI elements. The other side to that coin
Hey,
is the
Jacob, let me
creative.
pause. Let me pause you
Yeah.
for a moment there, because
Yeah.
this is something that when you're talking about wireframes,
Mhm.
let me see if I've got wireframes right. A lot of times you're presenting however on a computer screen or in person, but your wireframes are basically, you're kind of like roughing out what a
Yeah.
page is going to look like, right? So you have big box, little box, circle, but there's
Pure
no
black and
real,
white.
right? No real graphics or anything there. No
Yeah.
type fonts, no colors. So it's just basically, you're just outlining where stuff is going to go. Do I have it right?
Yeah, I mean, like, it really does look like a blueprint.
Yep.
Yeah, and sometimes, even our clients are confused, like, why is it black and white? Well, that's because we want to not distract the conversation from being just about the structure and how we're going to be displaying some of the content on the site.
Right. So, Jacob, do you often run it? This is something I'm always curious about. I think it's sometimes hard to make that leap then from wireframe to, oh, this is what the page looks like.
Hmm.
Oh, I
Yeah.
how do you overcome that, or how do you help lead a client, gracefully from a wireframe, which is, again, it's very rough, to here's your finished product. Like, what's the technique that you use, and
Right. Yeah.
it
So
just seems tricky.
we go through that visual direction phase, which is how I started to say sort of the other side of that coin as well. And I also like to have a visual in my mind of, what that direction is going to be as I move into wireframes. I think that's going to be a personal preference on the designer. But for me, I like to have that vision in my mind as I move through a wireframe. But really, that there's that visual direction. So we'll go through a concepting phase, where we start talking about not just the business goals, but also the creative goals of the website, understanding how they want people to perceive their brand values and who they are as a company. And that's going to come through in, the choice in typography. Are we using serif fonts or sans serif fonts? What are the weights of those fonts? Because those can really communicate different things.
Sure.
It can convey elegance, it can convey confidence. Maybe you have something that's more of a classic feel because you are a really, really well-known company for having a very strong legacy within your industry. So we can play to that by picking out typography that lends itself to sort of that story as well. So those are things that I really try to push in that side of the conversation or in that phase. Um, Color palettes as well. Some companies, come to us saying, "Hey, these are our brand guidelines. We had another branding company do this for us." At that point, I'm implementing it. I'm acting on that brand and putting that into the digital space. Some people's branding is already centered around being digital. Some of it is centered around very traditional CMYK, this is print media, whatever.
Yep.
And then we kind of have to play into, okay, we need to update these things because your brand palette isn't passing accessibility standards for the way that we would like to use it. So like one of the, orange is always such a tough color because it's a really nice bright color and it
Yep.
attracts a lot of attention. But you try to put white text on top of that, and it's not going to pass. And if you darken it, then it turns brown. So it's those very small details that we have to think about in that phase. But at Ascedia, as we're going through that phase, we like to have that collaborative approach with our clients. We don't necessarily want to do a grand reveal, just because we want to make sure that we have a appropriate understanding with our client and that we're being transparent with them as well about how we're understanding their business, their brand, and then what it is we're actually creating for them as well, because we are an investment for them. So
Sure.
they should get what they are expecting out of us, and maybe we even exceed their expectations if we're doing our job right.
You know, Jacob, a couple things. If I could go high level again, you were talking earlier on about some key steps that take place in the process, and I like how you were talking high level strategy, but you also just finished now with some execution. And I had a boss, one of my first bosses, she would always say, you know, strategize with execution in mind. They both have to go hand in hand because it's so key. But from a high level perspective, you had talked about, hey, we gotta be mindful about who our audience is. And when I start there, that's the customer, that's the client. So you were talking about, we got to build something that's going to work for them. But then you started talking about, okay, their customer, and how sometimes they might not understand fully who that is. And that's our job to kind of guide them. And what's that journey? What's that customer journey looking like? I think that's so key. And it's good to hear you think through that and talk through that, because it's critical. And the other thing you talked about, which because I know you have such a creative perspective, I liked how you were talking earlier on about the appreciation for creativity, and how you were saying manufacturers tend to go just into blues and this and that. I got to tell you, gone are the days. I mean, do you guys remember B2B? I think it was B2B magazine or B2B, whatever. It was like there was a publication just for B2B, and then there was the other, it's over. And if you're thinking that way, you're thinking wrong. So you cannot think in a box like that. I've seen some really good creative coming out of the manufacturing world. And so I like where you're going, because you got to approach it that way. It's like, stop thinking that way. Shoot for the stars a little bit, because the expectation is it should be creative. It's a brand. We got to start thinking that way. A lot of manufacturers don't, some do, but many don't think of themselves as a brand. They are.
Yeah, for sure. Jacob, one of the things you mentioned was user testing.
Yeah.
Just go into a little bit of detail of what that exactly is. I mean, it sounds pretty self-explanatory, but just in case people aren't aware of that, just what do you do, and what are you looking for when you do user testing?
Yeah, so really we want to get the website in front of actual users. There's a couple different ways we can go about doing that, but to keep the conversation simple, we'll get into it. And we'll screen record them. Depending on the strategy for the user testing, right? We could test a very specific piece of the website, maybe something that's really complex UI. They're interacting with a very specific tool. And then to kind of have a broader focus, we could also just get a general pulse check on the website. How are people perceiving it? Are they able to complete their general main tasks on the website? So really, we're screen recording them. They're verbally talking about the actions they're taking on the website. They're talking about their feelings as they move throughout the website. Are they feeling frustrated? Did they really like that interaction that they just had? And it's really not testing the user as the name implies, it's testing the website. And that's something that we make known too. It's the user really can't screw up throughout this. We just need to make sure that the website is performing the way that it's intended to perform. And if not, what can we do to fix those problems that user base had encountered as we were testing it? So I would say typically at Ascedia, we're doing more of that broader approach where I'll set up the user test where we do have that really broad top of the funnel. Hey, let's just give me a first impression. We showed you the homepage for, maybe 15 seconds. What are some words that came to mind when you saw the website? Did you think that the website was inspirational? Did you think it was very serious? Then after that, scroll throughout. Let's give us more of a general impression of what you're thinking of this. And then from there, once we have some of that general impression, I'm going to say, okay, how might you go about finding, a case study from this website?
Hmm.
And it's really important that we structure our questions and tasks during that user testing so they're not leading questions. Because we don't want to hint at what they should be doing.
Sure.
It has to be as broad as possible so that we get the most natural response from them. Because at the end of the day, I mean, it's like they're not going to have someone moderating them as they actually use the test. So we try to make that environment as natural as possible.
Yeah.
Hey, Jacob, let me ask you this. What is the philosophy? How do you handle, we've all seen it, the set it and forget it. There's clients out there. It's like, you just built me a website. Hurrah. And I think what a fail. It's like, getting the site, to the starting line is phase one. And then once it goes live, it's like, there's an obligation and there's a lot of strategy. Talk about the importance of, what happens when someone does the set it and forget it? They launch it and they just say, goodbye, Ascedia. I don't need to take care of this site anymore. I don't need to put content. Talk about that, because I see it and I've experienced it.
You're not going to get your return on investment. You really should be building your website as a communication platform for your business. You should be coming up with new, fresh content for your website. User and customer expectations are going to evolve over time as the tech giants are constantly creating user-centric experiences, and then they come visit manufacturing A's website and it doesn't meet that. Why do I have to do things this way when I'm on this other platform and I can just easily do it? So there's that aspect to it, and they also should be just optimizing it over time. Okay, like maybe you had a campaign launch. Okay, how did that perform? Are you tracking the correct data for that? And then in addition to that too, I think a lot of times we'll get into conversations where, there's two different paths that we could go down to accomplish a task. The question then is, which path do we take? There's consequences for each path, right? Part of my job is helping the client to understand what the consequences are for each of those paths. And I think that's really when we start getting into A/B testing, which, going back to your website being this live, evolving thing, I think that's where A/B testing really comes in handy, because you can see what's going to fail, you can see what's going to succeed, and then obviously you pick the path that was the most successful. It doesn't have to be this huge investment each and every single time. It can be these small incremental updates as you go along. And if you're making those smaller incremental updates as you go along, you're not going to have to shell out for a huge redesign, every couple of years.
So let's just stick on that for a minute, Jacob. And I'd love to get your take on this, because one of the questions we have here is, it's kind of like a car, right? Let's use that equivalent.
Sure.
You got to get an oil change. You got to get tires. If you want to keep a car running for a while, you got to put in some maintenance. That's just the fact. But at some point, it's like, I'm probably better off getting a new car rather than sinking money into this old one. It's just getting more and more expensive. Things are breaking down more and more.
Yeah.
And I'd say the same kind of similarities maybe in the same could be said about a website. So Jacob, in your estimation, even though you're doing certain things, even though you're updating, how long does a website in today's world last?
This is such a controversial. We just had a client ask this. This is such a controversial question.
That's why we have it. That's why we're asking it, man. We're hard hitting. Kurt and I we're putting
you on the spot.
Questions. Yeah.
I would ballpark 3 years. I think some people would say that's a long time in terms of technology. And, I think other people would say for the investment, that's no time at all. I would say by the time you're hitting that 3-year mark, you could be having a new site with a better CMS experience, just because we know things are constantly evolving. Your CMS is basically going to be sort of the base of your admin experience. And depending on your CMS, there's going to be constraints around that as well. So yeah, I would say 3 years. I think also in terms of industry trends as well, in terms of the visual appearance of your site, there's going to be things about the appearance of your site and it has its roots deep into the foundations of your site. So at that point, you might want to start looking at a redesign. we did have one client. This is the same client that was selling insurance that was coming off as a charity. Another comment users made about them was that the design felt outdated. And when you're dealing with insurance and user accounts and those types of sensitive data things, you know, it starts to build a lack of trust with your audience as well. You know, can I really trust you with my sensitive data when your website looks like it's from 2013?
Yeah.
So there's definitely that aspect to the visuals as well.
Hey, Pat, I actually, I like how you said that. I've used that too. And, you know, it's like, I liken a website to a car. You're right. It's like a brand new car. You know, it's like you drive it off the lot. Granted, you still have to check the oil at some point. You still have to check the tire pressure, change fluids. I mean, there is an obligation to a new car at some point. You can't just drive it for 10 years. But I like how you then spun it just now. It's like, that said, at some point, let's say you do the things you're supposed to do. I changed the oil. The fluids got switched out. At some point, when does it make sense now to ditch the old car and buy a new one? And I like how you phrase that. Yeah. It's a good way to break it down.
Jacob, you talked about dealing with clients, and I want to get your take and go into this a little bit deeper. And that is, I'm sure you have worked with some clients that have a pretty strong visual in their head and maybe could communicate that of where they'd like the site to go, right? Like from a design standpoint.
Yeah.
And I would think in a lot of ways that's got to be nice for you, because now you have okay, good. You have a very distinct point of view. Let's work on that. I think on the flip side of that is someone who really doesn't, like, they understand they might have problems with the site or hot buttons. I can't update things. I can't do this very well. But from a design creative, it's kind of like, I'll just know it when I see it. So how do you work with those types in order to kind of get them over the hump and say, you know, this is probably where you should go?
Yeah, it's always an interesting dynamic when we get into those conversations, because clearly I'm very passionate about design,
Right.
but on their end they really might not be. They might be like the conversations that we have with them that really resonate with them are like Google Analytics and marketing, and you know, this is the amount of clicks you're getting on this. And then I have to approach them and say, you know, how do you want your website to feel? I get blank stares across the room. Okay. So that's where we have to start building that relationship and understanding with them. I would say it's going to start coming down to, I would go into a competitive analysis, really like, hey, this is where your current competitors are at. You can see they all look the same in this specific way. Here is where the most modern, best looking websites from what I have seen, and it could be in your industry, or it could just be an actual, you know, trend in the digital space as well, to kind of start forming that idea. I mean, I'm going through one of these discussions later this afternoon with a client who's, you know, not necessarily doesn't speak to this naturally. You know, this is where the digital space is heading. This is what's inspiring us right now. I hear you. This is how I'm going to implement what I'm hearing and apply these different styles to it. So, which again, I think really helps us that we do have these multiple touch points throughout this process, because if they didn't have this idea and then I kind of went off and did my own thing, did what I thought was cool, and then showed it to them again, okay, it's not going to work out very well, I would say, in 90% of the cases, because we don't have their buy-in. They don't trust us yet in design. They probably don't even trust the topic of design to begin with. They're probably just like, hey, just give us a website.
Right.
But we know and we believe in the value of design at Ascedia. So yeah, I think the approach for clients like that is educating them on that, where I break down that conversation into smaller parts and saying, I picked out this typography because this typography mirrors your brand values in this way. Like in this conversation I'm having later this afternoon, you know, I have 2 different T's that I'm showing them, and I have different parts of it circled saying, hey, this is where the character of your business is coming in because this typography has this characteristic. And typography, you know, it's going to take up 90% of your website. It's huge. So it pays to have that conversation when, you know, the rest of your competitors are using, you know, something like Open Sans or like maybe Arial or something. It does add to that layer of polish. So having that conversation with them, I think involves educating them on where that space is at and what good design is going to look like. And then what is, you know, that mid-tier design, and then what's going to take them to that next level.
Well, you know what's cool about the way you explain it is the easy way to go about anything is to take someone's order. You know, it's like, you want bacon and eggs, I'll make you some bacon and eggs. What you're talking about, Jacob, I like, it's like a big part of this is trust, educating, and having presentation skills. And obviously, you know, because at the end of the day, it's like, unless you're able to sell it through effectively, it's not going to work. What happens in a situation where, I mean, I would love to say that we all have home runs and say, hey, everyone does what they're supposed to do, or they follow a recommendation. I mean, how do you handle that? Because I'd be willing to bet you go through the process and you could do everything correct. Jacob, Ascedia, Pat, everything. We're doing it the right way, but you know what? They're not listening, and you know, boy, oh boy, this is not going to be good. I mean, how do you handle it? We all face this. How do you go about it?
It's so tough. It's so tough to have that where you feel like you're constantly just hitting a wall with the client. I think that can happen for multiple reasons. Maybe one of those reasons is because there is a lack of trust and they are their own safe space and we haven't become a part of that yet in the relationship with the client. That's why, you know, I show them my work. I said, you know, I played around with a few different options. I did experiment with this. I did experiment with this. Sometimes I'll show them those sort of failed experiments so they can see the work and understand that process. So this wasn't just me drawing a rectangle on a page and calling it a day and then told them that they have to like that. I say, this is why you should like this because I did go down these other paths. This is the optimal path for what we have discussed thus far. I think after that conversation's been had and we're still hitting a wall with them, at that point, you know, I suggest, hopefully, if we can, A/B testing what they wanted versus maybe what we wanted, if they are open to that. Otherwise, we have to, you know, at that point, ship what they have and, you know, make that compromise on that specific point of the design and put our efforts into a different part of the design and say, okay, you know, us as an agency, maybe we think we lost that battle here, but we're going to put our efforts over here and win this battle that might be more important. So,
you know, one of the things that we talk about a lot at Ascedia, Jacob, is just the marrying design with development, right? Not always an easy thing. So talk, Kurt and I, how do you go about that? How do you make sure the design that you're coming up with can work with where the developers are going? You know, it might sound easy. Well, can't you just talk to them? But a lot of times, you know, I've heard of situations where that has become problematic. So how do you ensure that that happens and happens smoothly?
I think a couple different things. I think step one, it's important to have designers understanding the environment they're designing in and designing for, first and foremost, understanding what those constraints are going into it. I think, you know, second part of this is getting the developers involved in the design process early on. A lot of designers aren't going to want to do that. They just want to create, you know, it can be an ego trip. They just want to create the best, coolest thing, whatever. And they're chasing, you know, that quote unquote shiny ball. And the developers have to be there from the start. They don't have to be heavily involved, but I think they should be aware of where your mind is at and where you want that design to head. It is scary for designers to do that up front. And I think that there can be some friction there as teams start to get used to that dynamic. I think we saw this at Ascedia as well. But I think you'll get to a point where you'll start you know, reaching a certain cadence between both of those teams, building momentum, and then it turns from friction into inspiring one another. Hey, I'm coming at the design from this standpoint. The developers could say, hey, that's a really cool idea. We actually have this in our toolkit on the development side. What do you think about putting a, for example, like a dynamic color background in here that's pulled from the picture that the admin uploads to that area? So then you start bringing in, you're using technology also as a design tool as well at that point, because everyone can bring something to the table. But basically my main point is to get development involved early on is key.
You mentioned this earlier as well, is a site needs to stay relevant and needs to stay timely. Because as things start to fade and look at it, it just wears. It wears on the brand and it takes things down. And you may not want to visit as you said, a site that looks like it's from 2013. Jacob, how do you stay current? How do you stay relevant? What content do you consume to stay up to speed on what's going on? Because it's changing fast, right?
Yeah, it feels like almost impossible to stay on top of all of it and then also do, your actual work and then stay current with the rest of the industry trends. I think the easiest way for me to stay current with all of this stuff, I mean, I'm on a email newsletter called Sidebar, which is geared towards designers, but it does have some front end stuff in there as well. That's been a great resource. Because they provide all of these links like, hey, here's a new tool, here's a link to an interesting blog article. Finding passive ways for me to engage with those trends has been, I think, the biggest factor in that. I mean, you do have websites like Dribbble, which I think is sort of a problematic website because you have a bunch of designers on there just doing stuff that other designers like, which is not always based in reality. I would say my newest one and my most favorite source of staying up to date has been through Instagram. At this point, I've trained my algorithm to continually feed me these types of posts and these types of resources from other designers, and there's been some development in there as well. There's tons of accounts out there that will just upload like, hey, here's a quick tutorial on how to do this new thing that Figma supports. So that way, I'm in front of my TV at night, not watching TV and scrolling through my phone. And now I'm also consuming new design trends and new design resources. And then I also just save that. So I have a general resources area on my Instagram. I have general inspiration. I think those are basically the same two, resources and inspiration. So one's a little bit more tactical than the other, but yeah, just keeping your eyes peeled and your ears open.
Jacob Burr, thank you so much for your insights today. This was awesome. You gave them some great insights on how to work with clients, where to get inspiration from. Jacob, you've got the last word. So how do people find out more about you? How do they get in touch with you? Plug whatever you want to plug. The mic is yours.
Great. Yeah, you guys can follow me on Dribbble if you want to, or check out some snippets of my profile at Dribbble. So that is dribbble.com/Jacob Burr. Dribbble is 3 B's, and then my last name is Burr. Other than that, you can add me on LinkedIn as well. I'm gonna be honest, my LinkedIn account's pretty dusty, so go on to Dribbble. That is less dusty.
Jacob, thanks again for being on. Cheers, everybody.
Thanks, Jacob.
Thanks, everyone.